Okay, so now we're going to drape the basic skirt with 2 darts. All right, we're going to start with a piece of muslin and make sure that muslin is a little longer than you need it. And I'm going to start by first locking it in right here at waist. I'm lining up my selvage with my center front because I want that right on grain. So again, I'm going to put my length grain right at center front. So I'll line up the edge of my selvage right there, and I'm going to lock it in right here at the waist to start off with. Like so. And now I'm just going to pin, lining up the edge of my selvage right with center front. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to put a pin in here just to hold my muslin up for me. There we go. And I'm going to pin down as I line that selvage up with the center front, the edge of my selvage with center front. I'm just going to pin about every 3 or so inches. And there we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pin over to princess seam. So let me unpin this. And I'm going to start here at the waist, and I'm going to pin over until I find my princess seam, and I'm going to lock it in like so. And I'm going to continue all the way. And I'm going to line it up with each one of these pins. Go along the hip line. And we're just getting that nice and smooth. Like so. Now we're going to come over here to side seam. And what I want to do is bring it so that my length grain is parallel with my side seam. Right now it's not exactly parallel. My length grain is traveling at an angle. So I'm going to bring this up until I can see that it's parallel. Like so. And now I can see it's parallel with my side seam. And I'm going to lock it in right at my side seam and hip intersection. So right there's my hip line, and here's my side seam. So I'll lock it in right here. Like so. And now I'm going to pin down my side seam. Pin that right there for a second to hold that. Smoothing as I go. And I'll just kind of line it up with the pins that I have over here at Princess. Get it nice and smooth until I get to the bottom of the form. Alright, so this is what I have so far. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to smooth this up right up to my waistline. Okay, so I'm going to smooth that up, and I want to keep my length grain right at waistline. So smooth it up and then lock it in right there at intersection of waistline and side seam. Go. And again, I'm going to go ahead and just put some pins in here, coming up from my hip line up to my waist. Making sure that's nice and smooth. If you ever need to readjust any of your pins to smooth out, that's totally fine. Okay. Now you can see here's all the fullness right here that we're going to convert to our darts. Okay. This is what we're going to create our contour with. So let's go ahead and do that. I have all this fullness right here. I want one of my darts to be right where my princess seam is. Okay, that's where the first dart will be. And then the next dart will be about 1.25 inches over towards side seam. So let's first go ahead and try to divide this as evenly as I can, this extra fabric. So I have all this fabric here. I'm going to put a pin in. Here's my princess seam. I'm going to put it in about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch before that princess seam. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of manipulate this fabric and try to get it evenly divided between those two areas, like so. Okay, and for now, I have it divided now. I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in right in between. I'll put 2 pins just to kind of lock it in place for now. All right, And I don't need all this extra fabric up here. I don't want all the extra fabric, it makes it harder. So I'm going to remove that extra fabric, and I'm going to come down past side seam, and I'm going to leave about 2 inches of fabric past my side seam. So let's go ahead and cut that away. Go. And again, I'm going to remove some of this, leave about 1 inch to 2 inches above the waistline. There we go. All right, so let's go ahead and pin in our first dart. This dart is the one right here at Princess Seam. I have my pins here at Princess Seam. I might have to remove some, and I'm going to work this fabric over and get that dart right in there, right at Princess Seam. Okay, and I'll have my leftover fabric here on this side that I can then create my new dart. Okay, so let's start here at Princess Seam and start pinning in our dart. I'm going to start right at the waist, and I'm going to pin through. I'm going to pinch my fabric between my fingers, and I'm going to pin through both sides of that fabric as if I'm sewing it, and I'm going to follow that right down my Princess Seam. Okay, I'm going to stop after I put 2 pins in. I'm going to start this next dart. Again, I want this next dart to be about 1.25 inches over from this dart. So I'm going to use my ruler and just kind of measure over 1.25 inches and make a mark, and that's about where I want my next dart to start. So let's go ahead and just slide this fabric over, and what we can do is kind of pin over from side seam along the waistline and kind of trap that bubble over, like so. And we can also smooth it down here over if we need to. You may have to readjust pins here and there, it's not a big deal. There we go. And we could kind of start, and we could start pinning this dart in as well. And again, I'm pinning through all layers. And go back to this dart and pin in that one a little bit more. I can get one more in this dart until it gets right to 0. And that looks good there. Go back and make sure my waistline is nice and smooth. That looks good. That looks good in there. Might have to readjust this dart just to pull a little bit more out. If you need to adjust your darts a little bit, that's fine. If you need to let a little bit out or take a little more in. Okay, there we go. All right, we've now draped the front part of our basic skirt with 2 darts. We're going to go mark some key elements now. Let's mark around our waistline. Remember, if you have a thick piece of twill tape around your waistline, either pick the top or the bottom of that twill tape to be the waist. I like to go with the top. And I'm going to mark that waistline all the way around. Okay, I'm now going to mark down my side seam. So I'll find that side seam, and I'll just mark right down it. Now let's go to the bottom of the form. like so. Okay, and just as a indicator, I sometimes mark the bottom of my form. Okay, very importantly, now we're going to mark our hip line. Okay, starting at center front, go ahead. This is our constant line that's parallel with the floor and doesn't have any shaping to it. So we'll use the hip line, we'll measure down from the hip line to find the bottom of our hem. There we go. We're also going to mark our darts. Mark both sides of the pins and the darts. So here's one side of this first dart. And then pull the fabric back and mark the other side as well. Make sure you intersect it right through the waistline. Do the same thing for that second dart. Mark both sides. There we go. And then I'm going to obviously label this center front. I'll just put CF. Okay. We now drape the front of our basic skirt. Okay, now that we've draped our front skirt, we can go ahead and drape the back of the skirt. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to release my side seam and just move these pins to the opposite side here. And I can just gently roll that back, revealing the side seam of my form. Okay, let's go ahead and grab another piece of muslin that we can use for the back skirt. Okay, I have my piece of muslin I can use for the back skirt. I'm going to go ahead and line up my selvage, which is my length grain, with my center back. Make sure that this piece of muslin is a little longer than we need it. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to first lock in right at waist. So bring the edge of my selvage right to the center back. I'm going to lock right at the top of my waistline. Right there. And now I'm going to line up that selvage with center back all the way down to the bottom of the form. I'll just pin my fabric right here to hold it. And now I'm going to pin about every 3 inches down my form, down center back. Again, lining up the edge of my selvage with center back. And again, this puts our length grain right at center back, just like we did with the front. Okay. Now, again, we want our first dart. We're going to do 2 darts in the back of this. We're going to want our first dart to start right where our princess seam is. So the first thing I'm going to do is smooth across my waistline and pin right about where princess seam is. And I'm going to do the same thing all the way down to the bottom of the form. Everywhere I have a pin, I'll just smooth over. Smoothing out that fabric and forming it to the shape of the dress form. There we go. Now I'm going to come over and again, I want my length grain to be parallel with side seam. So I'm going to bring my fabric right now. Length grain is going at an angle. I can see the grain of my fabric. I'm going to bring it up, that grain up until my length grain is right at side seam. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and lock it in right at my intersection of side seam and hip line. Like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and smooth down my side seam. Like so. And now we're going to go ahead and smooth up our side seam as well, making sure length grain stays right there parallel to our side seam. And I'm going to go ahead and put 2 pins in right at intersection of side seam and waist. Like so. And then I'll just throw a couple pins in between, making sure I'm nice and smooth all the way up. There we go. Okay. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here, and here's my fullness, or this extra fabric we need to turn into contour or fit. Okay, so it'll become 2 darts, and we want to start separating that. Okay, so let's go ahead, and I'm going to release this pin right at my side seam, at my princess seam, and I'll start kind of just separating this as evenly as I can. I can release some of these pins down here, and just kind of eyeing my fabric. Again, I want that first dart to start right at my princess seam. That looks pretty good. And I'm just going to lock it in on both sides, like so, right at the waist. That looks good. And then there's my second dart. Okay. Before I go any further, I want to remove all this extra fabric I don't need. So I'll take my scissors, and about 2 inches away from my side seam, I'll cut up. And again, I don't need all this extra fabric at the top, so I'll trim away, leaving about 2 inches left at the waist. There we go. That makes it a little easier to work with. Okay, so let's go ahead. Our first dart is starting right here at princess seam. I'm going to pin through all layers right there. I'll actually lock in the second dart just for a moment. I'm going to adjust the second dart in just a moment, but first I'm just going to lock it in place so I don't end up pulling this fullness into that dart. And I'm just going to start pinning through both layers of this dart, just like as if I was sewing it. We want that to go down our princess seam. Okay. Now I'm going to measure 1.25 inches away from my first dart. So I'll measure over 1.25 inches, right about where that pin is. This is where I want my second dart to start. So let's go ahead and roll the fabric over there to that second dart and start pinching that in and pinning in that second dart. Okay, I'm also going to go ahead and pin up at my waistline to make sure my fabric stays nice and smooth there, where I want it to be. Might need to readjust this just a little. There we go. Alright. Now it looks like I have a lot of fabric right here on this first dart. I'm actually going to unpin that a little bit and release some of that, and I'm going to capture it in this second dart. So I'm just going to release a little bit of that fabric, like so. That looks a little better. And I'm going to repin that. Just a couple pins. And I'll come back here and readjust this second dart, pulling that extra fabric that I released from this one into that one. And now I'm going to go ahead and start pinning down this second dart and establishing it a little better. Okay, let's go back to the second dart, or the first dart, and pin that a little bit more. I can release some of these pins here. A little bit of extra there, but that's fine. That looks good. Okay. Put one more pin in right here. Let's do that dart. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to trace off or transfer some of this information to our muslin. Again, we're going to transfer our waistline. Okay, all the way to side seam. And I'm going to come back and transfer my hip line. center back to side seam. And I'm going to go ahead and mark my darts on both sides, so where they intersect with waist, and then down to the tip. And we'll do that on both darts. Make sure you mark both sides of them. There we go. Okay. Now I need to pin together my side seam. So I'm going to pin together my front side seam to my back side seam. I haven't marked my back side seam yet. I've only marked where waistline and hip line intersect with side seam. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and unpin here. Let's put some of these pins in over here for now. Just take these out. And I'm going to fold this back, and I'm going to find my front hip line, intersection of hip line and side seam right there. And I'm going to line up my front hip line with my back hip line. Make sure it's nice and tight. That looks good. And I'm going to pin through the side seam that I drew on my front. I'm pinning through all layers as if I was sewing them together. Come and look. That looks good right there. And now I'm going to pin down to the bottom of my drape. And I'm pinning right through that side seam. Okay, so I've pinned down on the side seam from the hip line down to the bottom, and that's what it looks like there. Okay, on the side, on the back. Let's go ahead now, and we're going to pin together the side seam from hip line up to waist, doing the same thing. So, bring the two together. And there we go. We've now pinned it together through all layers at side seam. And there's the back. Okay. I now need to transfer my center back, my side seam, or mark on my side seam on the back panel. So I'll do that right where I've pinned through, like so. And I'm going to also label my center back. Okay. I'll cut away some of this fabric, leaving about an inch or so. And let's clip, releasing some of the pulling we're getting there. And there we are. We've draped our basic 2-dart skirt front and back and joined them together. Okay. Now it's ready to be taken off the form, laid out flat and perfected. Okay.